Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is T.Y. Wine. I am chair of politics government at the Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois. I want to welcome all of you to the Robert Bone Distinguished Lecture. This lecture is sponsored by the Department of History, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and the Department of Politics and Government. And it is also co-sponsored by the Office of International Studies and Programs. Before I introduce today's speaker, please note that as an attendee, you can submit questions through the webinar's Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will relay your question to the presenter after his presentation. The webinar may appear differently on your device depending on the type of a web browser and device you are using. If you are having difficulty viewing or hearing the webinar, please check your personal setting. Now, today's speaker is Dr. John Sides of Vanderbilt University. Dr. Sides is professor of political science and William Cannon Chair Professor. He studies political behavior in America, and he also studied comparative politics. He is an author of many books on American politics. He has published articles in very prominent scholarly journals, such as the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, British Journal of Political Science, and Journal of Politics. He is a founder and publisher of The Monkey Cage. This is a blog site about political science and politics at the Washington Post, the newspaper. He has also written for many outlets such as the CNN, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times. His presentation today will examine the 2020 presidential election, including the long-term trends and short-term shocks that shaped this dramatic year. The topic of his presentation is the 2020 election and the future of the American politics. Without further ado, Dr. Sides.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Wang, and thanks to everyone for having me be part of this distinguished lecture series. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but it's a real pleasure to be with you here tonight virtually and to talk a little bit about this election and what happened and why it happened and then what it might mean for the future of American politics. The work that I'm going to be presenting tonight is based on a book manuscript that is forthcoming hopefully by September of this year. And the title of that book is The Bitter End, the 2020 Presidential Campaign and the Challenge to American Democracy, that I've co-authored with two other political scientists from the University of California, Los Angeles, Chris Dosanovich and Lynn Babrick. And this book, which is serves as the basis for the presentation that I'm giving today, does our best to use the tools of social science and political science in particular to understand what happened in the election. So in simple terms, that means there's a lot of graphs, and unlike journalistic accounts of presidential elections, there's probably not quite enough gossip. So that's what you've signed up for tonight. Lots of graphs, and unfortunately, not too many juicy tidbits. Unless you find graphs to be juicy, which you should. So I want to give you a quick outline of how we're going to proceed. I think we can tell the story of the election maybe in three simple chapters. We can talk about the past, that is the trends that were already present in American politics leading into 2020. The present, or at least the present as of a year ago, which is what happened in the 2020 election, why it turned out the way that it did. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the future and where do we go from here. And the short story is to, of course, expect a lot more of what we've already experienced in the years to come. So this is not a story of dramatic change. This is really a story of continuity between what preceded the 2020 election, what happened in that year, and then what's likely to happen in the future. So let me start by focusing a bit on the past and talking about the trends leading into the election. One of the ideas that we talk about in the book, which is very much a mainstay of political science research, has to do with what the members of the two parties believe, what Democrats and Republicans believe, both among elected leaders and among ordinary voters in each party, and how that's evolved over time in ways that we usually describe as a pattern of polarization. And there's a couple of ways to think about how that polarization is taking place. One of those facets is what we would call a tectonic shift. We use the metaphor deliberately to describe a process that is slow moving, gradual, but obviously accumulates to create, in this case, long-term increases in the differences between the two political parties. And there's a few different ways to see those differences. If you look at roll call voting in Congress, you can see that Democrats and Republicans are often and increasingly on different sides when it comes time to vote yay or nay on a bill. If you look at the public, you can look first at the demographic differences between the parties compared to what was true, let's say 50 years ago. The Democratic and Republican parties are much different from each other in terms of characteristics like race and ethnicity, to some extent gender, whether or not you are religiously observant. So demographically, the parties look somewhat different. And you can see the same thing in certain kinds of political attitudes as well, particularly attitudes that have to do with the role of government in managing the economy or providing for social welfare in various ways. The two political parties are increasingly distinct on those important issues. One of the consequences then of having the parties increasingly different from each other is that it shows up in what voters say is true. This is one trend that has been part of political science surveys since the 1950s. The question is, do you think there are any important differences in what the Republicans and Democrats stand for? And I've charted here just the percentage who says that there are important differences. And you can see that beginning in the late 1970s, and then again in the 2000s and 2010s, this has increased sharply. Many of you, particularly if you know your history, will be familiar with the old phrase, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. That's not what the vast majority of Americans think. In other words, they perceive the differences that we can chart in various ways, whether we're looking at members of Congress or whether we're looking at voters. Another facet or another aspect of this kind of polarization, another tectonic shift, has to do with how people feel about the political parties. Imagine you were taking a survey and you were asked a simple question. Here's a scale, goes from 0 to 100, and 0 is a very cool or a very unfavorable feeling. 100 is a very warm or a very favorable feeling, and 50 is neither favorable nor unfavorable. Where would you put the Democratic Party and where would you put the Republican Party? What's happened over time is that people's view of their own party, which is unsurprisingly fairly positive, hasn't changed very much, but their view of the opposite party has changed quite a bit. I'll show you a similar set of trends from the same survey project. It begins in the late 1970s when these questions were first asked. The top line is the average rating on the 0 to 100 scale of your own party. So you can see that the average has been around 70. And there are two ways in which the survey has been conducted over the years. Primarily for a long time, it was in person or on the phone. And then in more recent years, and particularly in 2020, during the pandemic, when there was no in-person interviewing, it's conducted online. That matters in particular when we look at ratings of the opposite party there, the orange line. You can see that the average rating, which was close to the 50 neutral point in 1978, has declined to 31 in the surveys that were conducted in person or on phone. But you can see that when you conduct the survey online, people are much more willing to express a negative view. And this is consistent with other research on what online polling is and how it differs from other ways of doing polling. And so as of 2020, when we only have the online reading, the average was like 19, significantly lower than even the online polling that was done as part of this survey in 2016. So we can think about polarization in this tectonic way, not just in terms of what voters believe about the issues, but what they believe about the other party and how favorably or unfavorably they feel towards it. Now, a second facet of polarization is different. And we call this the so-called identity shocks. This is a much shorter term process. You can trace it back maybe even no more than 4, 8, 10 years in some cases, depending on the question. And this process differs also because of what kinds of issues we're talking about. I use this phrase identity inflected issues. It means issues that have to do with race or ethnicity, nationality, gender even, religion at times. And in particular, as you've seen from American politics over the years, oftentimes identity inflected issues focus on the experiences of African Americans in particular, as well as those of different kinds of more recent immigrant populations. So what identity shock refers to is the fact that in a very short amount of time, we've seen much greater difference between the two parties on these issues. The example I'll show you that comes from our book has to do with the issue of immigration. The longest standing poll question about immigration asks people whether they think the level of immigration to this country should be increased, decreased, or kept the same. And just for illustration, I'll show you the percentage of Americans who say that we should increase immigration, and I'll break that down by party. So these are from Gallup polls starting in 1965. And you can see in these early years where the little dots kind of signal when the polls were conducted, 1965, 1977, 1986, 1993. There's almost no difference between Democrats and Republicans. As we get into the 2000s, right, a fairly modest difference opens up. And by the time we get to the poll that was conducted in 2015, there is some difference, right? So I've marked there that at that point in time, 30% of Democrats said that we should increase immigration, and 11% of Republicans said that we should increase immigration. So we went from a difference between the parties that was essentially zero as of the early 1990s to a difference of around 19 points, or about 20 points. But notice what's happened even in the last 4 years. I flagged to you Trump's inauguration really because I think it's the catalytic event in changing the attitudes of Democrats. Democrats react against Trump's agenda on many different issues, and immigration is one of them. And so in 4 years, you've seen a 20-point increase in the percentage of Democrats that want to increase immigration. And that's a very large change on this issue, on almost any public opinion issue in a very short amount of time. And if you think about the difference between Democrats and Republicans, we've gone from a difference of 20 points to a difference of getting close to 40 points in just 4 or 5 years. It's a really remarkable change. It's not tectonic in the sense of, it took forever, right, for this to accumulate. It's something that happens, it's much more punctuated, and it's much sharper. So we have tectonic shifts, we have identity shocks, and then we have what we call in our book, calcified politics. We have, you all know what calcification is, for example, in physiology or in the body. And the idea here is, right, is that things are increasingly set or and stuck. And the most visible manifestation of that is the challenge that arises when you ask voters to defect from their party or to express a negative view of their party's president or to vote for the other party's president in an election. It's a natural consequence of having larger differences between the parties that you would be less and less inclined to vote for the opposite party, given how different they are from what you think or what you believe. And then finally, one last idea that I think helps us understand the 2020 election. We live in an era of what we call partisan parity. The parties are relatively equal in size in the most general sense, which means a couple things, right? First of all, as you guys have seen in recent elections, control of government is often up for grabs. It's up for grabs again in 2022 in the House and Senate. We are not living in a period of one-party dominance like we did for many years when Democrats had control of the House and quite frequently control of the Senate. And as a consequence, in an era of partisan parity, even small shifts, right, can make a difference for election outcomes. So calcification suggests that those shifts are getting smaller, but they do exist, and they can make the difference between winning and losing. And so it's not surprising then that we see the parties fight as hard as they do with each other when so much is at stake. To give you one sense of what partisan parity looks like, I'll show you again survey data from the American National Election Study that plots the percentage of Republicans, percentage of Americans who identify as Democrat or identify as Republican. And this includes people who either identify with the party or say they are independent but actually lean toward one of the two parties. And when you look at that graph over time, what you see at the beginning of the time series in 1952 is in some sense the New Deal coalition, right? This is the group of Americans that had coalesced behind the Democratic Party as a consequence of the Great Depression and World War II and the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt in particular. And so Democrats at that point in time had a quite substantial advantage in party identification. And then over time, that just ebbs. And now Democrats and Republicans are very narrowly divided. There's roughly equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. So this is what partisan parity looks like. All right, so going into the election then, we have these trends in polarization, both tectonic and more shorter term shocks. We have calcification and we have partisan parity. So as we start to tell the story of 2020, I think there are two questions that we should ask. First of all, why did Biden win and Trump lose? That's the simplest and most important question. And then finally, I think the second question, which was very much on people's lips in the week of the election itself and the vote counting, was why it was so close. Certainly it was closer than some public polls led us to expect. And I think many people had calibrated their expectations about the election with the polls, despite the challenges that the polling community had in 2016. And so then the outcome, although it was obviously good news for Democrats who wanted to take back the White House, led to a lot of hand-wringing and wonder and worrying among Democrats as well about why it was not a more conclusive repudiation of Trump and why the party didn't fare as well down the ballot in House and Senate races as it had hoped. So I want to tackle the first question. And I think it's a story we can tell in a nutshell with sort of three main ideas. Trump was fundamentally a chronically unpopular president compared to previous presidents. On top of that, he was presented with a political opportunity, which is to say, and something that could have been helpful to him politically, and that was the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic is a terrible thing, of course, but speaking solely in terms of politics, there is an opportunity for political leaders, and Trump missed it, as we'll show in comparison to many others. And then finally, unlike in 2016, when Trump was facing an opponent, Hillary Clinton, who was also somewhat unpopular, in 2020 it was very different. Biden was much more popular. And so the things that aligned to help Trump in 2016 were not there to the same extent in 2020. So let's talk a little about what it means to say that Trump is chronically unpopular. One way to see this is just to take presidential approval ratings, subtract the percent who have a disapproving view from the percent who have an approving view, so that positive numbers are higher approval, and negative numbers are lower approval. And then just graph that over the first 4 years of Trump's presidency and compared to these other presidents. So I'll show you a panel of graphs here for these that show you these different comparisons. So just to take the upper left-hand graph, this compares Trump and Obama. So you can see that when Obama became president, his net approval rating, the percent approved minus the percent disapproved, was positive. So there were about 40% more people who approved of him than disapproved. And of course, that changed fairly quickly over the first year of his presidency. And then Obama hovers roughly around parity between approve and disapprove until the year of his reelection, when he actually moves back into positive numbers. Compare that to Trump. So when I say Trump is chronically unpopular, I just mean that as a strictly empirical statement. Like, he was chronically, meaning year after year, unpopular in the sense that more people disapproved than approved of him. And you can look at Trump, and I'll just go across the graph. You can look at George W. Bush, you can look at Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, Reagan, Carter, Nixon, Eisenhower. And there are certainly moments in time when some of those previous presidents, particularly George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter, were less popular than Trump. Trump does not set a record in terms of the extent of his unpopularity. The record low is not as low as Carter's, for example. but he just sets a record, as it were, in terms of the stability of his unpopularity. And obviously, when we're talking about an election in which the incumbent is running, which is not what happened in 2016, right? That Trump was the challenger to some extent of the party in power. Now he is the party in power. He is the incumbent. Obviously, people's view of that incumbent matters for how they think about the election. So Trump was starting here with a significant challenge. What's obviously implicit in this graph is that Trump doesn't do much better in the fourth year of his presidency when the COVID-19 pandemic starts. Recalling that the earliest cases were detected right at the end of the calendar year of 2019. And so by January of 2020, we were very much discussing whether we were going to experience a similar set of events. And of course, it was clear by March that we would. So let me just zero in for a second on Trump's approval rating in 2020 leading up to the election itself. So these are based on the averages of public polls from 538, the political website. And you can see in the gray line is his overall approval rating, which is basically what we were graphing on the previous slide. Now we're just zooming in to look at it at the finer level of granularity. And the darker line is his COVID approval rating, which is to say, how do you approve or disapprove of how Trump is handling the COVID pandemic? I want to make a couple of observations here about when I say that Trump's handling of the pandemic did not help him. So first of all, if you think back in time about the chronology of what happened, Trump in the initial 2 months, roughly January, February of the pandemic, his public comments tended to downplay the significance of what was happening. And he, essentially suggested that we had very little to worry about. Now, privately, we know he thought differently. He told Bob Woodward in a phone interview in February that there was real cause for concern, and there were members of his advisors and staff that were telling him the same thing and knew that themselves. But it's not until the middle of March when Trump declares a national emergency. The tenor of his comments changes quite significantly. For a period of a few weeks, he says that it's going to be bad. He issues some guidelines, right, which suggest that we should restrict gatherings and other kinds of things. These are guidelines, and they're obviously meant to be implemented by states and localities, but nevertheless, they're consistent with some of the measures that were already being put in place. Schools going online, universities going online, professional sports events being canceled. And you can see right at that point in time, Trump gets a very rare bump in his approval rating of about roughly 5 or so percentage points, and a significant bump in his approval, the approval of his handling of COVID. But what happens basically within a month is that Trump pivots away from this more somber tone that appears to suggest that we're going to need to make sacrifices in order to deal with this crisis. And beginning in the middle of April, he calls for reopening. You may remember some of this was quite combative. He sent a series of tweets in all caps that said, "Liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia." He attacked the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, by name. And so you can see at this point in time, both Trump's COVID approval rating and then eventually his overall approval rating start to decline. And if you think about his overall approval rating, it's going to fall back roughly to the level it is, slightly below the level it was in January. And then by the end of the campaign, he is only going to get it back to where it was in January. Okay, so he could have gone into the election if he had been able to maintain, I think, his more proactive stance with regard to managing the pandemic, the stance that he had in the middle of March. He might have gone into the election year with an approval rating higher than it was. But instead, he was basically back to that same low level of approval. Now, again, it would be different if lots of other leaders had the same problem. But there were many examples of national leaders as well as governors whose strategy on the pandemic differed from Trump and who also reaped, to some extent, a political benefit as well. I'll show you some polling that compares views of Trump to views of world leaders that's been done by the polling company Morning Consult. And so they have these averages that start again in January and then continue through October. What I've done here for each of these leaders, Scott Morrison from Australia, Merkel from Germany, Justin Trudeau from Canada, Macron from France, Modi from India, Boris Johnson from the UK, and Bolsonaro from Brazil. What I've done here is I've taken their approval rating as of the beginning of January, and I've set it at 0, right? So everybody starts at 0, like, and then I've just to see what's the change relative to what it was at the beginning of January. You can see very clearly is that leaders like Morrison and Merkel and Trudeau get a significant political boost from the pandemic as it begins to spread into their countries. So for them, this is particularly happening in the spring of 2020. And so in many cases, they see their approval increase anywhere from 20 to 40 points, their net approval. You can go to France, and even there, where Macron's benefit was much smaller, it's still higher and more persistent than Trump's. Johnson is an interesting case because in some sense he emulates Trump. He has a period where he takes the pandemic quite seriously, and then he also, again, much like Trump, pivots to calling for reopening, and he experiences the same, an up and a down. It's just a much larger one than Trump experienced. Both Modi and Bolsonaro famously were not particularly proactive in the way that they dealt with the pandemic, and in some sense their experience mirrors Trump. And the thing I want to point out here about this graph, and about also, we've looked at all the approval ratings of all the state governors as well, and it shows a similar kind of pattern. The important thing here is it does not necessarily matter whether your country is weathering the pandemic well, or whether there are lots of cases or not a lot of cases. What matters is your stance, like the way that you're perceived to be thinking about the pandemic. Are you being acknowledging its severity, calling for these measures to deal with the infections, the overload in hospitals, and the like. And so again, it's not the objective reality on the ground as much as it is, how you are communicating symbolically and also in terms of practical policy making with the public. And the best example of this is Andrew Cuomo, who experiences a big bump in his approval rating, even as New York is one of the worst hit places in March and April in terms of the number of COVID infections and deaths. So again, I think this suggests that there was, again, even though, right, opinions of Trump may be difficult to move, that's calcification, right? You can see like that even that little bump in March, right, potentially could have been significant for him in terms of whether he would have had a better shot at re-election. The last point has to do with Biden and Trump and people's views of them. Throughout the election year, I was part of a survey project with my co-authors that did weekly surveys of about 6,000 Americans. And we asked them, do you have a favorable view or an unfavorable view of Joe Biden and also of Donald Trump? And so much as we've been doing with these approval ratings, we can just calculate the percentage who said favorable minus the percentage who said unfavorable. And that gives you a sense of their net favorability. And I'll show you how that looks over time. And then, alongside some of the various events of the campaign. So focusing here on the top part of the graph for a second, so the blue line is Biden and the red line is Trump. And if you look to the right, you can see sort of where the numbers are. There's a line at 0, and that Biden is almost always above that point. And then Trump is almost always below that point. In fact, he's usually below -10. So that Trump's has negative net favorability, Biden has positive net favorability. And if you see some of the changes here over time, if you just start with Biden for a minute, Biden has a little dip when he suffers defeat in the Iowa caucus, the New Hampshire primary, and only rebounds after the South Carolina primary. It ebbs somewhat as the spring goes on. That seems to be a feature mostly of Republicans coming to have an increasingly unfavorable view of Biden when we looked under the hood. But then you can see that rally towards the end of the campaign, driven in part by Democrats, coming to have a more positive view of him. So by the end of the campaign, Americans as a whole, among Americans as a whole, Biden's net favorability rating is about +12. Trump, meanwhile, you can see the same pattern we showed you on the previous slide, which is to say, look at the period between April and June. And you can see that the period of where both Trump calls for reopening, and we can also talk a little bit more about the murder of George Floyd and Trump's reaction to that, and what that may have meant for his standing. Maybe I'll save that one for Q&A. You can see that his net approval rating drops down. And again, it only rallies by the end of the campaign, but it's basically rallying, roughly to where it was at the end of January. So he's not really, in some sense, getting much more popular than he was early in the election year itself. At the bottom of the slide, I've just put Biden's lead in the trial heat poll. So this is, who do you intend to vote for as of today, Biden or Trump? And you can see that Biden's lead typically in the beginning of the year was around 5 percentage points or so. And then you can see beginning in May, that increases to about 8 percentage points. And then we know that's too high, right? We know that he's not going to win by 8 percentage points. He's going to win by 4. We know that now. But the point is that he went from a race that was closer, right, to a race that was less close. And I think that shift is important, right? Even if the polls were on average overestimating Biden's vote share overall. So again, it suggests that at a point in time when Trump really needed to find a way to become more popular and to narrow Biden's lead, the opposite was happening. And this is why it matters at the end of the day. I know that, again, election was very surprising from the standpoint of comparing what happened to the pre-election polling data. But if you just look at the historical relationship between presidential approval and how well the incumbent party does, 2020 looks pretty typical, not much different than what you would have expected. Let me show you a graph that illustrates that. On the horizontal axis, this is the president's approval rating. And I plotted it for June of the election year, just for the sake of like a forecasting exercise. Let's go back a few months before the election, and let's see where the president was. It's kind of fun sometimes to think about predicting elections before a lot of the campaign itself has even taken place. Then on the vertical axis, it says the incumbent party's share of the major party votes. So just of the votes for the Democratic and Republican candidates, what share went to the incumbent party, the party in control of the White House. And of course, you can see what you would expect a positive relationship, right? The more popular the president, the better the president's party does, regardless of whether the president's running for re-election or not. And the point I'm just making here is that Trump's approval rating at that point in time was not far from what we would predict. The diagonal line captures that relationship prior to 2020. So the 2020 is not far from what we would predict. Roughly speaking, every additional percentage point of approval you have in June of the election year is worth about 1/3 of a point of vote share at the end of the race. And that's when I say that it would have been helpful for Trump to have, even as of June, an approval rating like it was in March when he got that bump. So think about adding 4 or 5 points to your approval rating. That's the equivalent of adding a couple more points of vote share, right? And that's bringing the election from a Biden 4-point win to maybe a Biden 2-point win, or maybe even a little narrower than that. And we know that the Republicans have had an advantage in the Electoral College in the last 2 election cycles. And so a narrowly divided popular vote win is not necessarily enough for an Electoral College win for the Democrats. And so, again, that's a hypothetical. We can't replay history and have Trump have a higher approval rating and see what would have happened. But I'm just showing you that these kinds of small shifts can be consequential, even in an era where we have a lot of polarization and calcification in public opinion. So that's the story, I think, of why Trump ultimately lost and why Biden won in a nutshell. We can talk about other episodes and details and thoughts in Q&A. So let's talk about why the election was so close. So one of the explanations, getting back to calcification, is that even though small shifts matter, right, the presence of calcification still means that there were not very many differences between 2016 and 2020 in terms of how people are voting. And I'll show you what I mean by that. The other part I think we can document is that the identity shocks that we saw began in the 2016 campaign, and intensified during Trump's presidency, only became more intense in the 2020 election. And then the process of polarization, we argue, creates gains and losses for both candidates. The net of that probably helped Biden, right? That's the difference between winning and losing, but it's also the case that Trump is gaining votes among people, among certain groups. And he's doing so, and Biden's doing so in ways that create a stronger pattern of polarization. So to talk about calcification, one way to look at that is to look at counties. And to look at we'll just do the Democratic Party's vote margin in each county. Like, what percentage of the vote did the Democrat get in the presidential race minus the Republicans percent? That's like the Democrats' margin, positive or negative, depending on the county. Take the absolute value of that, so it's no longer, all we're interested in is just how is that number large or small? An absolute value, doesn't matter whether it's negative or positive. And then calculate it from one election year to the next. Okay, so if lots of counties move a substantial number of percentage points, right? One candidate is a lot better than that party's candidate did the previous election cycle. But there's going to be large numbers, a large shift. But if very few counties experience large shifts and most counties stay close to what they were like in the previous election, then those differences from election to election year are not going to be very large. I'll show you what the pattern looks like over time. Okay, so this is the absolute value averaged of these county level shifts in the Democrats' percent of the major party vote. And you can see that there have been years where the average shift in the Democrats' percent of the vote was 10, 15, 20 points in 1976. Those were unusual years, right? The pattern we've seen since then, since roughly 1984, was differences of like 5% on average, dipping down, spiking up a little bit. And the only thing I'm showing you here, or trying to highlight here, is just how small the shifts were from 2016 to 2020. That's what that dot captures. We're talking about an average of maybe 2 percentage points difference between the county level results in 2016 and the county level results in 2020. And note, by the way, that is despite, as you guys have observed, a massive surge in turnout, which led to a level of turnout we haven't seen in decades in American politics. But nevertheless, even all those additional votes doesn't really change the partisan balance of the voting in counties very much. Unsurprisingly, you can see the same thing at the individual level. I've been part of a different survey project that has been interviewing the same voters since 2012. So we did this, for example, we did a post-election interview in 2012, and we interviewed the exact same people and did a post-election interview in 2016. So you could say, okay, what percentage of Obama voters in 2012 voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016? And what percentage voted for Trump? Again, these are self-reported voters. I'm not using this survey to take account of turnout or anything like that. We're just asking people if they voted. If they said yes, we count them as voters, and then we say, who'd you vote for? So if you look at the results from 2012 and 2016, it looks something like this. So you read across the row, right? 81% of Obama voters voted for Hillary Clinton. 9% of Obama voters voted for Donald Trump. 5% of Romney voters voted for Clinton. 84% voted for Trump. So I've highlighted the 5 and the 9 because those are the people who are switching, right? They're not calcified in some sense. And in particular, you guys will remember, having followed that election in 2016, the importance of the Obama-Trump voter. They were more numerous than Romney-Clinton voters. They were particularly prevalent in certain key battleground states in the upper Midwest. I mean, this is the pathway for Trump to an electoral college victory, even though he loses the national popular vote. Okay, so we can interview the exact same people in a third election, and we can compare 2016 to 2020. And when you do that, what you see is a much higher level of stability indicative of this kind of calcification. The vast majority, 95% of Hillary Clinton voters said they voted for Joe Biden. Only 2% said they voted for Donald Trump. Similarly, only 2% of Trump voters said they voted for Joe Biden. You know, despite the sort of work of the Never Trump contingent within the Republican Party to try to siphon Republican votes away from Trump to Biden, it doesn't amount to much at this level. And so you can see that the overall level of stability is higher in the 16-20 period than it is in the 2012-16 period, and that's what I mean by calcification. So the results at the county level are mirrored in many ways by these results at the individual level. Next part of the story has to do with identity shocks. And what we observed over time after the 2016 election is, as I showed you in that initial slide, increasing differences between Democrats and Republicans on the identity-inflected issue of immigration. And the same thing is true when we look at issues very much at the center of the murder of George Floyd, the protests afterward, and a lot of the ensuing debates. Here, I'm going to use the same set of data that interviews the same people in just after 2016 and again in 2020. And here, we're going to ask them their views of the police, and we're going to ask them their views of Black Lives Matter. And we're going to do it on the same 0 to 100 scale I talked about before. When you look at those data, starting with views of the police, what you can see is that Republicans have a very positive view of the police that was very stable between the two survey interviews taken roughly 4 years apart, with the intervening event in the spring of 2020 of the murder of George Floyd. Democrats, and to some extent independents, exhibit a different pattern, a pretty steep decline in their support for the police. And we have other data ourselves, and there are other public polls that show that these changes in views of the police very much occurred in the immediate aftermath of the murder of Floyd. So this particular survey is conducted with a wider time period between the 2 points. But what I'm suggesting to you is we can tell that a lot of that shift is due to the events of early 2020. Not to something that happened in 2017 or 2018. So you can see that there's much more difference between Republicans and Democrats in their view of the police. Similarly, there's a difference in their views of Black Lives Matter. The movement becomes more popular among Democrats. Again, the murder of Floyd is important here. Views of Republicans don't change very much. To the extent that they do change, Republicans become less favorable toward the movement. And so again, just as with immigration, the parties are more different now than they were even 4 years ago. Moreover, one of the things that we can show with our data, because we're interviewing the same people at 2 different points in time, is that most of this change is coming about because Democrats in particular are changing their views of things like the police and Black Lives Matter. It's not because people are changing their partisanship to match their views of those groups. Party is driving the change. Democrats are both reacting to Trump and also reacting to ideas and messages coming from their own party leaders, which are less sympathetic to the police and more sympathetic to the ideas espoused by Black Lives Matter. So there was and the importance of this, I really don't think it can be overstated, because I've looked back at the headlines in the immediate aftermath of Floyd's murder. And at that moment, when there were these shifts towards more sympathy for the experiences of African Americans, for a less sympathetic view of the police, there was a moment where a lot of the news coverage said, this is a moment of the politics of this issue have changed, that there's going to be more unity now. Even Republicans realize it. And I can show you a series of quotes from Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, Mitch McConnell, the senator and the majority leader at that point from Kentucky, that they've said very sympathetic things about what happened to Floyd at that moment. But over time, I think the same pattern of polarization reasserts itself. And we talk about it in the book, how the messages from political leaders evolved. And Trump here, of course, plays a crucial role in this in terms of his criticism of the protests that took place after Floyd's murder. And so in some sense, what looks like a moment of unity and just becomes another episode of partisan polarization, particularly on these issues related to political identity. And so the election year ends up manifesting some of that. And so as opposed to these major dramatic events breaking down patterns, right, they're reinforcing patterns. And that helps, I think, keep the election closer than it might have been if there had been a real sea change in public attitudes. The last point I want to make about the election has to do with this broader polarization in voting. And here I'm just going to show it to you very simply. We can do this in a variety of different ways. How well does Donald Trump do among conservatives in 2016? How well does he do among conservatives in 2020? What about among moderates? What about among liberals? And what about Biden relative to Clinton in 2016? How does he do among conservatives, moderates, and liberals? And here I'll just show you with this is a question that just allows people to categorize themselves. Like you can choose whether you identify as a conservative, as a moderate, or as a liberal. And so if polarization is happening, what should be true is that Trump is doing better among conservatives in 2020 than he did in 2016. And Biden's doing better among liberals than Clinton did in 2016. We have yet another survey project that did large samples of Americans in both years. And we can make comparisons based on what the patterns were in 16 and the patterns were in 2020. And I'll show you what that looks like. What I've plotted here is just the net gain for Trump, net loss for Biden, or the net loss for Trump and therefore the net gain for Biden in percentage point terms. So what that tells you is that among conservatives, Trump gained about 9 percentage points relative to what was true in 2016. Biden gained about 4 points among moderates and about 5.5 points among liberals. And this is true when you categorize people on a variety of different issues. We looked at abortion, we looked at gun rights, looked at views of race and racism. And again, the same pattern shows up, right? Trump's doing better among conservatives, Biden's doing better among liberals. Who does better among so-called moderates depends a little bit on the issue. All we want to suggest is this shows a pattern of polarization. This, by the way, is true among all racial and ethnic groups, the major racial and ethnic groups in the United States. Trump does better among Black conservatives, Latino conservatives, Asian American conservatives. And there's a similar pattern among liberals of these different racial and ethnic groups as well. Why would this be happening? Well, I don't have all these graphs in front of me. I'm trying to spare you guys a few of them, but we can also show you that the percentage of Americans who think that Donald Trump is conservative increased during his presidency. We can show that on certain issues, Biden was perceived as a little bit more liberal than Hillary Clinton was in 2020. So compared to Clinton in 2016. So in some sense, the perceptions of the candidates are consistent with more polarized voting in terms of ideology. And that's also consistent with the fact that on issues, including policing, Black Lives Matter, immigration, but others as well, the difference between Democrats and Republicans is larger than it was in 2016, right? So over 4 years, people see the candidates as more polarized. They themselves are a bit more polarized in terms of their views on issues. So it's not surprising then that voting behavior in 2020 looks like this. And again, the purpose of this exercise is not to come up with a precise estimate of exactly how all of these numbers translate into a shift in the national popular vote from, a 2-point win for Clinton to a 4-point win for Biden. It's just to show you that you can find groups where Trump does better and groups where Biden does better. The net of that may have advantaged Biden in the end, but it also helped keep the election close. And particularly because Trump was able to gain and draw additional support from conservatives. Okay. I'll say a couple of brief things about the future, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I'm going to just make 3 points that illustrate what I said at the outset, that a lot of what we've seen to date is just going to continue. And the first point is an obvious one. I think anybody following politics knows what's sort of shaping up for the midterm. We live in an era of partisan parity. Control of Congress is oftentimes up for grabs. That is absolutely true in 2022. And because of the traditional pattern where the president's party loses seats at the midterm, there are very likely to be a GOP gains. And I mean, it's too early to present a precise forecast, but GOP gains are obviously the most likely outcome. And given the narrowness of the Democratic Party margins in the House and the Senate, it could be that Republicans have control of both chambers of Congress. That is a recipe for more polarization. You've already seen calls from some more conservative, more Trump-aligned Republicans in particular, Republicans in Congress, that we should impeach Biden. And so you could imagine significant pressure in 2023 for Republicans to pursue impeachment. It's unlikely that's going to lead to conviction in the Senate, but nevertheless, right, we're going to have, you can imagine that kind of battle again. All right, so there can be a lot of things that this change in party power could do to intensify some of these trends. I think it's particularly important that polarization has intensified despite having the change from Trump to Biden. You could look at the Trump era and look at the polarization that occurred and say, oh, that's just Trump. That's Trump style politics, us versus them, divisiveness, et cetera, et cetera. That argument was made many times. And I think that's an accurate description of a lot of Trump's style of politics. Well, Biden comes, and Biden is, of course, much more concerned about portraying himself as someone who wants to unite the country. Presidents say that routinely, of course, but Biden, appears to mean it. He certainly rejected some of the politics of the left wing of the Democratic Party during the primary. And yet when Biden becomes the president, views of him were more polarized the moment he took office than was true when Trump took office. And a year into his presidency, the views of Biden are more polarized by party than were views of Trump. This is the Gallup data that they just released at the end of the first year of Biden's presidency. It shows you the percentage of Democrats, independents, and Republicans that approve of each president, calculates the gap between the two. And this is just to show you that at the end of the first year of Trump's presidency, the gap was 75 points. And the gap at the end of Biden's first year of presidency was 83 points. So very little about Biden's presidency has in any way created, I think, a deviation from this pattern of polarization. And the pattern is much greater than it was, not just under Trump, but under Obama and Clinton, George W. Bush and others. So I think that's the era we're living in, even when a president tries by virtue of their demeanor, their rhetoric to try to lower the temperature of politics. It's very difficult to do that. So then the last point from the slide about the future has to do with identity politics. I don't have to tell you guys the many ways in which you've seen debates about identity politics play out, since Biden took office. You could have seen some of that, for example, in the off-year elections that took place in Virginia, where we're debating in the gubernatorial race, things about critical race theory and how race is being taught in schools, those kinds of things. Continued debates about policing and whether to sort of defund the police or pursue some other path. And one of the points that we make in the last chapter of the book is that part of the reason why these identity politics are so tough to sort of get rid of or to mitigate or to, again, like lower the temperature of, has to do with just very basic differences in how Republicans and Democrats view the experiences of the different social groups that are oftentimes at issue when we talk about identity politics. Imagine you were taking a survey and you were asked, how much discrimination do you think each of these groups experiences? And you could choose on a scale that ranged from none at all to a great deal, right? There's 5 points on this scale. And you were asked about Black people, Asian people, Muslim Americans, Latinos, African Americans, already said that, women, Jewish Americans, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. That looks just very different depending on which party is answering those questions. These are the averages on that 5-point scale. And they're sorted just in terms of low to high in terms of Democrats. And what you can see is that Democrats tend to perceive that the groups that experience the most discrimination tend to be women, as well as religious minorities like Muslims and Jews, and racial and ethnic minority groups like African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos. They perceive those groups experiencing much more discrimination than do Christians, men, or white Americans. Republicans, it's not that way at all. If anything, Republicans perceive a little bit more discrimination against white Americans than they do against Black Americans, for example. They perceive a little bit more discrimination against Christians than they do against Jewish Americans or Muslim Americans. And I think the point that we want to make is that it's very difficult to have political debates around specific issues like policing or immigration, civil rights, critical race theory, et cetera, have those not be like sparks for these very difficult and divisive debates. If Republicans and Democrats see the landscape of discrimination so differently. In some sense, this kind of perception, the perceptions that this graph illustrates, tells you that we're not going to get, I think, a lot of partisan agreement on questions related to identity politics anytime soon, because Democrats and Republicans fundamentally disagree about which groups deserve additional help or additional consideration. So I tried, as I was putting this talk together, to come up with some concluding slide that might offer a more optimistic note, and I utterly failed to do that. So I'll just end by saying thank you. It's been a pleasure to present this research to you all, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Saiz, for this very informative presentation. And we will now take a question from the audience through the Q&A function. So please type your question in the Q&A. In fact, I already have a number of questions right now in the Q&A. What I'm going to do is I will read the question so that all the audience can hear it, and then we'll ask Dr. Saiz to help us to answer some of the question. Now, the first question is based on the parity graph. It appears that at the beginning of the series, 95% of individuals responded, but more recently, that number was down to 88%. How do you account for this change? And related to that is that it appears that there are more independent voters now than previously, and how does that impact your analysis?
Absolutely, very good question. Let me do this by just resharing my screen with you all, and I'll show you that particular graph again, so we can all look at it together. So this is the one you all will remember. So the first question drew our attention to the fact if you add up 59 and 36, and you add up 46 and 42, right, it appears that there is a somewhat larger number of people who don't identify with or lean toward each major political party. And that is true. There appears to be a little bit larger number of Americans now than was true in the early 1950s and 60s and 70s that identify as independent. And then when you ask them which way they lean, a second question, they do not choose either political party. Does not mean that they're truly independent. Like, again, they may have a partisan leaning that they just don't feel like they want to discuss publicly. Obviously, for many people, partisanship itself is not something that has a particularly positive connotation, so it's understandable that they might not want to sort of describe themselves in those terms. But that's absolutely, I think, what's happening here. Just there is a little bit larger segment now that identifies as independent than was true, at least in these early periods of time.
Okay. The next question also is related to independence, and that is, how do you factor in that independence in your analysis? How does that impact your analysis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, independents are in some sense not presented in that particular graph because we're focused more on the balance between the two parties in particular. To me, that doesn't mean that independents themselves are not important. To some extent, when we're talking about small shifts in election outcomes in an era of a high degree of calcification and parity, those shifts are either going to come about because of which party turns out at a higher rate, but it could also come about because independent voters shift their views in particular. And the broader work that's looked at the relationship between something like economic outcomes and presidential election outcomes, or presidential approval and presidential outcomes, to the extent that there's any kind of relationship that looks like a referendum on the incumbent president, that's being driven largely by independent voters, not by partisans. Partisans, of course, already have biased views of things like the president, not biased in a negative sense, just consistent with their partisanship, and they're not necessarily likely to vote differently based on those kinds of considerations, but independent voters would be. So they're clearly important here. I don't mean to suggest that they're not an important part of American politics or elections. just that I think a lot of the things that have been true in most recent elections in particular really draw our attention to Democrats and Republicans and to the differences between them. Thank you for the questions.
Next question. Regarding calcified politics, voters are less likely to vote for the other party. Are voters also less likely to defect to a third party? Are they less likely to stop voting completely?
So I think one thing that we've seen is that even in calcified politics or politics with a high level of polarization, a lot of people will vote. In fact, it's a story of increasing turnout, not decreasing turnout. And I think that goes to show you that part of what is motivating to people about politics is exactly the stuff that gives rise to these differences between the parties and polarization. People feel more engaged with politics when they think something's at stake. And they care more about politics when they have stronger feelings about the candidates or the parties themselves. That's one of the challenges, I think, about making American politics better, as I typically hear people describe it. People want turnout to be high. They want Americans to be engaged. They want Americans to be good citizens, but they also want Americans not to be too partisan. But unfortunately, it's hard to get both things simultaneously. Oftentimes, you have to have a high degree of partisanship to get people engaged and mobilized. It's like asking people to go to a sports game and care deeply about the outcome, but not because they're rooting for a team. And it's not quite clear how you're supposed to get interest in sports, but not team spirit. So I think that's one potential answer to that question. Whether or not they defect to third parties, that's such a good question. To me, I think third party is, the extent of third party voting is as much a supply side as it is a demand side thing. In other words, are there candidates just running to begin with? What made third-party voting go up a little bit in 2016 was a combination of having a few candidates that at least got some attention, Evan McMullen, Jill Stein, and having two less popular major party candidates. And so in instance, on the supply side, the major party offerings were a little less enticing, and there were the third-party offerings, therefore maybe looked a little bit more enticing. But then in 2020, when we saw more polarization, more calcification, the rate of voting for third parties goes down. So that's not to say that an unusual figure couldn't come along and supply that alternative. It's just, I think it's just hard. It's not just hard because American electoral rules make it hard for third parties and independent candidates to win elections. It's also hard to be a candidate that really truly captures something distinctive. There's often a notion that there's some sort of opportunity for a centrist candidate who's going to not be too polarized or too, given over to the liberals or to the conservatives. But in fact, if you look at like what voters want from a third party, voters don't really agree that it needs to be a moderate. Some voters want a more liberal third party or a more conservative third party relative to where the Democratic or the Republican parties stand. And I'm often fascinated to watch allegedly interested independent candidates try to sort of thread this needle. I remember Michael Bloomberg, when he was thinking about running as an independent before he ran as a Democrat in 2020, briefly. In 2016, he would talk about, he'd say things like, we need to crack down on guns and do more to protect the environment. And I was like, gosh, if there's only a political party that wanted more gun control and to protect the environment, oh, we do have that party. It's called the Democrats. Like, what are you offering that's distinctive there, other than the fact that you're a successful businessman who was the mayor of New York? So that's just to suggest that I think that the trends of polarization and calcification don't mean that there will never be third-party voting. It just, I think oftentimes it's challenging for third parties in this environment to really make a significant dent in people's predisposition to vote for a major political party. Thank you for that question too.
Okay, next question. Given the deep polarization in American politics, if Trump maintained a serious stance on COVID response, could we have expected to see a sustained improvement in his net approval?
I mean, that's certainly the hypothesis I floated. I could easily sort of talk myself out of that hypothesis, right? So I don't want to state it too conclusively. In the book, we make clear this is a conjecture. I think what would have made it difficult for Trump to do that. I mean, just leaving aside Trump, like just assume Trump could do it and stick with it, like this, more somber and stance about the pandemic accompanied by support for more restrictions that might limit the rate of infection and death. I think the challenge might be that ultimately there's just not that many people that would have come around to approving of him, even in that environment. Maybe American politics is so calcified that there's not just a floor on presidential approval ratings, where like it was difficult for Trump's rating to fall very low, despite a lot of the things that happened in his presidency on the various scandals and controversies, or the pandemic itself. And then also, in addition to the floor, there may be something of a ceiling. I mean, that's maybe why Biden started this presidency with a historically low approval rating for the first month of a president's time in office. It's like 54%. So maybe there just wasn't much Trump could do because there just weren't that many people who were willing to have their minds changed about Trump. That's why we don't know. But I think I do feel like the fact that Trump was able to at least temporarily raise his approval rating and the fact that some other leaders saw their approval ratings increase and then at least maintain some of that increase over time. I mean, maybe that raises the possibility Trump could have done a little bit better at the end of the day, had he pursued a different course in the pandemic. Maybe there would have been at least enough of a durable change that it could have benefited him politically heading into the election itself. But again, I don't view that hypothesis as in any way a firm statement about that alternative reality.
Okay, next one is more about the institution. How does gerrymandering play in all of this?
Great. So when people talk about gerrymandering, usually they're talking about partisan gerrymandering in particular, and the fact that in many states, the political party in control of the state legislature and or the governor's office can draw the districts it wants to draw. So there's a couple things that I think the ways in which gerrymandering has mattered, and at least in terms leading up to this current redistricting cycle, and then what appears to be true after the cycle's over. Leading up to this cycle, what was true is that Republicans did a very good job of gerrymandering, even relative to other partisan gerrymanders of the past, including gerrymanders that Democrats drew predominantly. And there's some disagreement over exactly how many seats this won Republicans, starting in 2012 when the new maps that were drawn after the 2010 census came into effect. Because a lot of it depends on what you're comparing the new maps to. Is it to the old maps or to some hypothetical set of nonpartisan maps or whatever it is? But it seems clear that Republicans earned themselves some seats. How many, we can debate. So in some sense, that gave them political power that was a little bit outsized relative to their the number of votes that they won. And that clearly had importance in terms of their ability to maintain a higher degree of representation in Congress, not always the majority, of course. But nevertheless, that helped them. What seems to be true now, based on the district maps that have been drawn, of course, some are still in process, some are being contested in court, is that what it appears to have done is that the major change is to reduce the number of districts that are competitive and to increase the number of districts that are quite likely to be won by Democratic or by Republican candidates. And so if your view of representation, right, is that we need competition in order to ensure good representation, we need districts that are relatively close to 50-50, then it's a cause for concern. It's certainly not that kind of pattern is certainly not conducive to changing patterns of polarization in Congress. You're likely to get relatively orthodox Democrats and Republicans coming out of districts that are drawn to ensure their victory. This is not a test. I mean, it's not a ticket to produce members who tend to be a little bit more moderate on average. So in some sense, the irony of that is that ultimately it might not hurt Democrats as much as the last redistricting did. They may end up doing a little bit better, in part because they've done some pretty significant gerrymandering themselves in a few states. But from thinking about the political system as a whole, and not just in terms of which party controls how many seats, it's certainly not the districting process that appears to be going on now certainly is not likely to produce changes in the composition of Congress that would be conducive to less polarization. If anything, it should be conducive to more.
Okay, next question about the partisan, two questions about the partisan differences. In your opinion, are the party much more divided than the past, or is the voters' perception overestimated differences? And what do you project the divide will be in the coming years? Do you think it will increase or not?
Very good question. I think both things are true. The first part you said is that there are these increasing differences in who the parties are, what they stand for. I think those are real. There used to be, conservative Democrats, especially that represented the South. There used to be Rockefeller Republicans who were more liberal to moderate in their political ideas. And there's fewer and fewer of those. The ones that do exist, like your Joe Manchins, a more moderate Democrat, or Susan Collins, a more moderate Republican, they get a lot of attention, right? But it's in part because they're increasingly an endangered species. At the same time, voters their perceptions are absolutely exaggerations. That's not evident in the graphs, per se, but there's been some interesting research that basically examines voters' views of the party almost through the lens of stereotyping, like who do voters think the parties are? And one of the things that's true is that voters think the parties are more demographically different than they are. Like if you ask voters, like what percentage of Democrats are gay or lesbian? The percentage of Republicans who think that what percentage of Democrats are gay or lesbian? Republicans think it's like 30% of Democrats are gay or lesbian. I'm not remembering the exact number, but it's a number that much larger than the actual number really is. And Democrats have similarly skewed perceptions of Republicans on certain dimensions. So it's almost as if our perceptions of polarization there is an underlying reality, but then we exaggerate that reality because we view the parties in this highly stereotyped way. And some of the research that's looked into this basically says that what appears to be the case when I ask you, like, what is your view of the Democratic Party on a scale from 0 to 100? Who are you thinking about? It seems that who people are thinking about is like political leaders, like who tend to be more ideologically polarized than voters. They tend to be thinking of like the hardcore ideologues. That's the sort of stereotypical person that they call to mind. And so in that sense, voters' views are more polarized than leaders are themselves, even though leaders are more polarized than they used to be. As to whether this is likely to continue, what tends to create, what tends to mitigate polarization are issues that create differences within parties. Sometimes even across party, like coalition, right? Because there are people who support that issue both in the Democratic Party and then the Republican Party, and then you can get, right, on that issue at least, a bipartisan coalition, right, that sort of muddies the typical pattern of polarization. So the question is, what would that issue be that's going to create divisions within parties that also then create groups of Republicans and Democrats that are aligned with each other more than they are aligned with other partisans in their own parties? And the answer is, I don't know. And part of the challenge with the trends that we've seen, both in terms of the slower tectonic type shifts on the more recent identity shocks, is that like increasingly almost every issue maps on to the existing party divide. And the new issues that come about, like COVID, end up getting mapped onto that divide. And then a moment comes like the Floyd murder, and it seems like, we might get something that transcends. Nope, it doesn't transcend the divide at all. We get back to the same old stuff. So I am not of the view that American politics is going to be static for hundreds or more years. It's very difficult to make that kind of long-term prediction. But in terms of the shorter term, an election cycle or two, it's, for sure, it's hard for me to just to think about what that issue might be that would serve to sort of deviate from this typical pattern of polarization.
Okay, related to the partisan difference.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the best way to have the difficult conversation about the race, immigration, if the people fundamentally disagree so much?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I certainly don't have any really expert answers to this. It's almost as if I should go back and get like a degree in social work or counseling or something and see if how much headway I can make on this. People that have done some work on this tend to try to create a much more structured environment in which those conversations take place. First of all, it's in person, not on social media. You know, it's not anonymous, therefore. You have to look people in the face. They're given a set of information prior to that conversation that sort of forces them to sort of sit down and learn a little bit about the issue. It's not a magic bullet to, like, you know, cure all the places in which we're a little bit ignorant about the details of politics and political issues, but it's sort of a starting point. And then you have a sort of a set of structured conversations that really are meant to be fully deliberative. And when you start, right, with that structure, people can rise to the occasion. But we're not often asked to act in that way. So these exercises always have a bit of an artificial feeling of like, we had a 2-day conference to encourage Americans to deliberate, and into that conference, they didn't look so polarized anymore. And I'm like, I absolutely believe that works. But the question is, how do you create that in a larger scale? And I think that's pretty difficult to do. The only other thing I would say about this that's easier said than done is that it's helpful to start those conversations don't let necessarily the current political agenda establish the agenda for that conversation, or don't let the most prominent ideas being articulated by political leaders frame that conversation. Because if we started the conversation around immigration in the Trump era with border wall, you know, that's like one of the most divisive ways you can start a conversation about immigration. But what if we started the conversation elsewhere? Like, what if we talked about other dimensions of immigration entirely? You know, what difference would that make? So sometimes when I talk to sort of students or to other folks about making politics feel a little bit less divisive or a little bit less emotional, I think to myself, you know, it would be helpful if we could start the conversation somewhere other than where Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whoever wants us to start the conversation, and then we might be able to make a little bit more headway. But again, that's easier said than done, because of course, most of the way in which we think about political issues and understand political issues comes from the messages and ideas that we hear from political leaders. So sometimes it's difficult to break out of that and see it through a different lens entirely. Those are a few thoughts. I don't think that's a great answer though to the question, because it's such a tough nut to crack.
Okay, there are 2 more questions about partisan differences, and I think we have the remaining time for totally 4 questions. The first partisan difference question is, if Trump's popularity and relevance in politics decline in the near future, do you think that the political polarization will decrease as well, or will it continue to intensify regardless?
Yeah. I tend to think it will intensify, or at least remain at its current level, rather than decrease. And part of that is because I think that the differences that emerged during Trump's campaign and presidency are already baked in. Like, the party coalitions are different now. And the views of partisans are different now. And I don't see that changing or going back as a consequence of not having Trump in the White House. The other thing I think that is an open question. So sometimes when people think about Trump and they think about polarization, they think about sort of Trump's particular issue agenda, which was, you can often focus on identity issues like immigration. They think about Trump's style, his personality and the like. And will that change? You know, would polarization be different if that stuff went away? And my sense right now is that I think a lot of Republicans not just tiptoe around Trump, but I think even if Trump were not part of politics anymore, would be tiptoeing around Trump-aligned voters or other Republicans who are Trump-aligned. And I think that it's difficult for voices that would might steer the party in a different direction that might result in less polarization. It's difficult for those voices to win in the current politics. What's going to be the reaction of Fox News personalities to a Republican who embraces immigration reform, the way that Republicans embraced immigration reform, some of them, Marco Rubio, others, in 2013, not that long ago, not even a decade ago. I mean, that's not that long, right? What would happen to them? Are there factions in Congress, the representatives that are more Trump aligned, that would, take you on immediately if they perceived you to be a Republican that's not sufficiently faithful to ideals of Trump? So I think the Trump, a lot of the Trump agenda is, that stuff's baked in. The Trump playbook is not the playbook of every Republican by any stretch, but it's the playbook of enough of them right now that it's tough to see that disappearing too. So I don't know. What we would need is, I think, a very different kind of Republican leader, like a presidential candidate or president. So that might change things a little bit at the margins, but still, presidents are also creatures of their parties. And to the extent that these differences are baked into the party, it's difficult for presidents to kind of completely re-engineer things. Trump discovered this himself because he was talking in the campaign like it would be a great thing to raise taxes on the wealthy, which is not the Republicans' orthodox position. And then once he became president, he abandoned that and took the Republicans' orthodox position. And they passed a tax cut that, largely benefited relatively wealthy people. So again, you can see that power of party even influences Trump to some extent, but I do feel like the way in which Trump has helped shape the Republican Party is likely to persist at least for a while longer.
Next one is that if Russia invade Ukraine and Americans are killed in the conflict, and what impact, if any, would this have on party polarization?
When American troops are killed in conflict, there can be, a rally effect, as we call it, a rally around the flag effect, which can contribute to a boost in approval for the president. And of course, the canonical example of this was 9/11 and George W. Bush having an approval rating of over 90% in one poll, at least. But that rally effect is really dependent on the reaction of Democratic and Republican leaders. If American casualties in Ukraine were just another way for Republicans to criticize Biden, right, for leading us into an ill-fated military conflict. And you already have Republicans, as you know, not all of them by any stretch, but there are prominent Republicans who sound very pro-Russia, when they talk about issues like Ukraine. So it'd be easy to imagine them criticizing Biden for supporting Ukraine if there was a war with Russia. So I tend to feel like you would get polarized enough reactions among the Democratic and Republican political leaders that would really basically reproduce polarization in the mass public, and you wouldn't see Democrats and Republicans come together to support Biden in this time of crisis. It would not be that kind of moment. It would be something quite different. That said, I'm very doubtful that we would, commit troops to a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But if we did, I tend to think it would be just more grist, for the polarization machine, as it were, rather than something that could transcend it. I'm trying to say something positive here somewhere, but I haven't been able to yet.
Okay, next question, I'm combining two questions together due to the time. One is both about candidates. One is that whether the military service or experience it should be a prerequisite for someone to run for public office. That's one. The second part of that is if an independent candidate were to win the presidency, what is the likely scenario? Could you walk that through?
Yeah, these are good questions. As we moved to all volunteer military and had relatively few, zero episodes of the draft, right, in the last 50 or so years since after Vietnam. Obviously, it's true that a lot of, I think, being elected to political office no longer requires military service, or it's no longer demographically likely you'll have had military service. Whether it should be required or not, I mean, to me, I tend to take the Constitution's view that we want relatively few parameters in terms of who holds political office. And in your question, you mentioned the ones that exist, like age, and for the presidency, being a native-born American citizen. And for Congress, obviously, we have somewhat similar, but a little bit less restrictive requirements. And in part, that I think that reflects, for me, the belief that good leadership can come from a range of different experiences, both, whether in the military or in other sectors of American life. It reflects a view that we don't quite know what we're going to need in a president at any moment in time. It's always tough to match the credentials of a president exactly to the moment or to the events that are going to happen that we can't predict. So, I mean, implicit in your question maybe is this question of whether George W. Bush would have thought differently about going to war in Iraq if, for example, if he had been, if he had actually served in war as opposed to not having to serve in combat in Vietnam. I don't know, maybe, but again, it's tough to know in advance. And so I tend to think of, I mean, I certainly want leaders to have, I have a frustration maybe that you have that we don't often get the leaders we probably should want or deserve, but I don't know that we should stipulate that, with constitutional type language. And the other question was how would you get to an independent candidate or say if we're talking about independent presidents, I mean, I think the best way the only real way for that to happen is for one of the major parties just not to throw a name in the ring, or or to sort of throw their support behind the independent. That strikes me as the easiest way to pull off a situation where you have to get the plurality of the vote, the most votes of any candidate, to get the electors from that state to vote for you in the electoral college. And I don't see a good path for that. It's hard. I mean, we to some extent we had this test a little bit because it was, people when Trump got nominated, it was like, was he the candidate the Republicans wanted? No. Most of them didn't. He didn't win the votes of most Republican primary voters, and many Republican political leaders didn't want him. And yet, at the end of the day, they had to make their peace, as opposed to throwing their support behind our independent candidate, because what would that mean? It would mean Clinton wins. So they don't want Clinton. So you can see why this is so difficult to sort of unravel this. That to me is that sounds a little like boring and obvious to say it, like you're not going to get an independent winner unless you don't have one major party contesting it. But I think that's a much more plausible path than the path of like the traditional pundit, who writes about this is just like, oh, there'll be this mythical figure who will arise and unite Americans of all races and faiths and creeds, and show us a new path in politics. And it's like, okay, I'm not sure who that was going to be. We'll have to, I'm sure, what was it in 2020? It was Howard Schultz from Starbucks. We had to read those columns about for a while. I'm sure there'll be another figure like that in 2024. But that's the path that's the hardest in some respects. So that to me is the simplest possible answer to that question. Want to do the last question?
The last question.
Yeah.
What impact do you feel ranked choice voting will have in future election, given the level of calcification and the number of independent voters or those who might defect to a third party? Yeah,
this is a great question. So you guys may be familiar with the idea of ranked choice voting, which has been employed now. Let's see, the state of Maine, number of cities use it. Alaska, I believe, is poised to use it. Instead of choosing, making one choice between two or more candidates, you rank the candidates in order, and depending on the system, tells you like how many rankings you have to do. Like if there are 20 candidates, you have to rank all 20, or just your top 5, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the theory behind ranked choice voting that's most important for polarization is that if you're competing not just for first choice votes, but you're competing to win some people's second choice votes. If you think that there are enough candidates in the race that your victory depends not just on winning a majority of the first choice votes, but you have to get to that majority, you're going to have to win some second choice votes that'll get added to your first choice votes. It encourages you to campaign more broadly. It encourages you to build a broader, more diverse coalition, therefore. And therefore, maybe you may run in a way that is so less partisan or less polarizing as a consequence of that. And I think that's plausible on its face. I mean, one of the questions that you have to ask is, how does that interact in a world in which you have a lot of districts that are pretty lopsided in terms of partisanship? So people that advocate for ranked choice voting typically say, well, we can't just put ranked choice voting into a system where each district elects one representative to the House. You have to have districts that have multiple members, right? So multi-member districts might have a district elects 3 members to the House. So then you're competing for one of those 3 slots. And that's where ranked choice voting can start to be interesting. So you really need some pretty substantial institutional reforms to be able to create, I think, an effective kind of ranked choice system nationwide. So in some sense, I view ranked choice voting as potentially presenting an opportunity, but again, I think getting it adopted on a wide enough scale and marry that to other kinds of institutional reforms that you would need to see its effects work, that's a pretty big lift. It's a heavy lift. Doesn't mean people shouldn't advocate for it. That's how we get political change, political reform gradually, but nevertheless, it would take a significant amount of reform to make ranked choice voting, I think, a truly effective way of mitigating some of these polarization trends that I've been describing.
Okay, thank you. I think that concludes today's presentation, and we would like to thank Dr. Sizer for his informative presentation and answering our question. I also want to thank the Office of International Studies co-sponsorship. This would not be possible without their help. Meanwhile, on behalf of the Department of Politics and Government, I would like to thank our audience for joining us today. Stay safe, stay healthy, and go you river. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.